Chronopunk, a novel, episode 13. This episode has three sections. It's three really important sections, I would say. We're getting towards the conclusion of the novel. So now I think every chapter has its own weight, and every episode is really crucial. So we start with Deborah giving her speech to the judges of the Supreme Court. So we had the lawsuit was filed, and the lower court was hearing the case. Bernanke was interrogated by Deborah. We went through this in previous episodes. And now we're at the Supreme Court, so we're implying that the lower courts upheld the Fed's decision of doing QE, and that Deborah now is at the Supreme Court. There is a section in the episode that mentions that Lisa, so the mission control in 2064, actually anticipated this. So they did anticipate that Mody and Deborah will not prevail at the lower courts, but they will get to the Supreme Court. And they even implied that the potential loss at the Supreme Court still could be judged as a win, because at least the issues were brought up to that level and the conversation was started. Now, Deborah makes some of the more crucial points in her speech. She talks about the Fifth Amendment, she talks about habeas corpus, and she talks about the necessity to include future generations in the conversation of property rights and decisions that are made today, as far as debt and spending of resources is concerned. This is a fundamental concept of the novel. This is the reason why the novel was written. It is to illustrate to the public what the concept of moral hazard and the concept of economic planning actually means if you don't incorporate future generations. Or another way to say this is that if you have certain pillars of law and values that underpin our society, such as habeas corpus, which is a concept and a law actually that underpins some of the fundamental values of Western societies. It means in principle that you can't detain somebody without due process. So you can't incarcerate somebody, you can't put somebody in prison without due process. It's the famous line, I'm going to read your rights before I arrest you. You have the right to remain silent, all of that stuff. All of that stuff is part of habeas corpus. You have the right to a lawyer. You have all these rights. But it extends from there to not just your body, your actual physical, biological right to own your body, and nobody can take that freedom away from you, but it also incorporates physical assets. To quote Deborah talking to the Supreme Court, she says, "The critical connection lies in that same demarcation line between the individual and the state, the line defined by property." She's really making a case for property rights here, the fundamental pillar of Western society that she is fighting to uphold here. Now, she's extending these property rights to future generations. I mean, this is the key concept of the novel. She's arguing that the US Constitution, with the Fifth Amendment in particular, has actually already taken care of that. She's making a point that we have to first acknowledge that the Fifth and 14th Amendment state very clearly that the government cannot just appropriate somebody's property without due process and due compensation. And then she makes the point that future generations are being infringed by QE, by money printing and debt and all of these things, and that therefore that is actually an infringement of the Fifth and 14th Amendment. It's unconstitutional. That's her main argument in front of the Supreme Court. She goes further. She makes some economic points also, important economic concepts, again, important for the novel, such as, for example, what would this mean for a society if we did incorporate future generations in our decision making today? We would have better planning, we would have more efficiency, we would have less waste, we would have a much longer time horizon in our planning, and we would have a better and a lot of our problems, actually, a lot of the problems that our society is grappling with, such as the environmental problems, the societal problems, inequality, a lot of these things could be solved with a longer term horizon planning, because if you plan long term, if you iterate over many generations, you will come to different conclusions today than if you just iterate over one generation. In other words, if you have a very low time preference, then if you don't care about time, you're going to make different decisions than if you care about time. If time is important, and if you want to iterate over many generations, you will make better decisions than if you just iterate over a very short time horizon. After Deborah's appearance on the Supreme Court, we go to Chicago. Mody's in Chicago. He's waiting for Deborah to come back. So she gave her speech in front of the Supreme Court. Moody's in Chicago. She's flying back to Chicago, and Mody has to make a decision. He has to make a fundamental decision whether he should stay or go back. So we're starting now to see the traces of Plan B. We're starting to see there's going to be quite a bit more in this novel that will hopefully conclude in a way that people will understand what the whole purpose of this mission is, and what the purpose also of the novel is. And Moody's making the first steps here. So he's thinking of staying. And the question is, of course, why would he be staying? What is it? And there is a plan B here. I can give that away. I'm not going to talk about more right now, but there is a plan B. There is a scenario under which Mody is thinking, if the lawsuit doesn't succeed, if he cannot stop the Fed from QE, then he might do something else, and we'll see about that. But so he has to grapple with those decisions. There's some romantic decision making to be made, because he's torn between two women that are 50 years apart. He's also torn between the decision to go back to his actual lifeline or to stay in a time that is about 20 years before he was supposed to be born. So those are, of course, interesting questions, philosophical questions. Now, the third section of the episode, in chapter 39, we're now back in Colorado in 2064, and Lisa's very upset because Mody made the decision to stay. He's not coming back. So Lisa's upset. She is angry. She cries, and she draws a big temper tantrum because her lover decided to abandon her, but also her operative decided to abandon the mission. She has some issues that she has to deal with that could make it very difficult for her to even it could jeopardize her career. But then the chapter ends with her coming home. They have a son together, Cy, and she kind of opens up a little bit. There seems to be more to this story. Now we'll reveal what that is, and there's going to be some twists and turns in this story. But I think the point here is really the most important part is, of course, Lisa's speech in front of the Supreme Court, where she makes the fundamental principle, where she lays out the principles that underline this whole novel and the concept, right? Why should we care about future generations? Well, we should care about future generations because they deserve to be cared for. And also it will make our lives better, and we are intertwined with them. We really are in a continuous timeline. Now, there are different scenarios of that timeline. You might call that the multiverse. But nevertheless, we're connected with at least one of those timelines. And we have the obligation as a species to morally and ethically make the right decision and take them into account. Now, how that can be done, this is not being discussed in the novel, and I think that would, break, of course, that would be a novel in itself. I think this is one of those novels, some novels, you could say that they can be summarized in one sentence, and some novels, every sentence could be a novel on its own, and I think this is one of them. Like, you could have a whole novel now talking about the idea of long-term planning or low time preference between or high time preference and what that does to society. You could have another novel talking about the relationship between two women in two different multiverses. Is that cheating or is that love? Is love transcendent in the multiverse? And then you could have a whole other novel talking about the habeas corpus and the demarcation line between state and individual and property rights. So there's a lot of interesting concepts that this I think Chronopunk brings up. And in this episode, in episode 13, we really are, the rubber meets the road when it comes to that. So I think these are important concepts. I also want to just bring back the narrative a little bit to the tension side of things. We want to keep this also entertaining. Like, I think we went this Supreme Court scenes and the interrogation with Bernanke and the talk about economics and moral hazard and QE has been quite academic, and the purpose of this novel is to give people an intro into these very important concepts, but through an intense narrative. And now we're getting back to that. We're getting back to a narrative which is just more fun to consume. Thank you.